Despite the civil unrest and despite the clear feelings of the nation, Keir Starmer is still to take any action against the small boats that are arriving on a near daily basis, carrying illegal and unchecked migrants into the UK. We are also experiencing one of the worst cost of living crises this country has ever seen, with a substantial number of people being unable to meet basic costs. We have learnt of a young lady who has died at the recent Notting Hill Carnival after being stabbed in front of her child on so-called Family Day. We are currently funding overseas conflicts which many people believe don't really concern us, and we're also putting our own civilians, our own military, in the firing line for overseas causes. However, despite all of these things going on and the country being somewhat in turmoil, Keir Starmer has decided to tackle what he believes to be the real issue, and that is people smoking outside. The Daily Mail said, Sir Keir Starmer has confirmed the government is looking at tougher rules on outdoor smoking to reduce the number of preventable deaths linked to tobacco use. Responding to reports that smoking could be banned in some outdoor spaces in England, the Prime Minister said, we have to take action to reduce the burden on the NHS. Now, very quickly as an aside, but a very important one, smokers are currently still a net contributor to the NHS. Given the extreme level of taxation on tobacco products here in the UK, the amount of tax that the average smoker pays in still outweighs the cost of treating smoking-related illnesses per capita here in this country. The details remain unclear, but smoking could be banned in pub gardens, outdoor restaurants and outside hospitals and sports grounds. Now, for anyone not from the UK, smoking is currently already banned inside any public spaces. So at the moment, what happens is that anyone who is having a drink or whatever in a pub, or if they're visiting a loved one in the hospital, if they want to have a cigarette or any tobacco product, they have to go outside, normally to a designated area, to have a smoke and then go back in. But these plans seem to be suggesting that that will no longer be the case, and basically all they'll be doing is pushing people further out, so away from the building, but then away from the building, and then away from the building, so they'll then be somewhere the other side of the car park. We're not saying that they can't smoke, we're saying they can't smoke here. And why aren't they banning smoking altogether? Well, it's still a cash cow for the government in form of taxation. Sorry to interrupt the video, just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you haven't done so already, then I do ask that you kindly click the subscribe button down below. 97% of people who watch these videos aren't currently subscribed, which is crazy, right? It's totally free. You can change your mind and there won't be any hard feelings if you choose to unsubscribe at a later date. If you do find these videos useful and you want to help me out, you can buy me a beer by clicking the link in the description below, and that also would be very much appreciated, particularly in this hot weather. Anyway, back to the video. Health experts have welcomed the plans, apparently. It depends what... I guess it depends who they asked. But the BBC have been told that some ministers have raised concerns about the impact the ban could have on the hospitality sector. Now, the hospitality sector has been struggling of late. Pubs were closing at quite a substantial rate. That's before we had the COVID pandemic a few years ago, which put the final nail in the coffin of many hospitality businesses. Many never reopened after the lockdowns. They have continued to struggle since then, partially because of a shift in societal attitudes towards pubs, but also just because of increased taxation and increased legislation around things like smoking in pubs and restaurants. Some business owners have already raised concerns. Pub landlady Lisa Burridge, 55, said pubs should be able to choose whether to go smoke-free. It's not up to the government to make that decision. Now, this has always been one of the key arguments, isn't it? Is that it should be a freedom of choice. If a pub wants to have a smoking area, or whether that be inside or outside, they should be allowed to make those choices, and market forces will dictate whether or not that is something the public wants. I am, for full disclosure, a non-smoker. I have never smoked, bar trying it when I was 13, 14, thinking it made me look cool and failing miserably. In my opinion, though, maybe there should be places where smoking is not allowed in pubs. For example, smoking at the bar, which basically subjects the staff in the pub, behind the bar, to constant smoke for however long their shift might be, which does no doubt have some form of health implication. But in a capitalist society which should be driven by market forces, there does seem to be a good argument that premises should be able to decide whether or not they want to allow smoking, and then let the customers decide with their feet and with their wallets which premises they choose to frequent. This will just be another hurdle we have to face in hospitality, and one we can do without, Miss Burridge told the BBC. Tony Harding, 57, a publican in Salisbury, said residents who live near his pub would not be happy if punters began smoking, blocking the pathway on the street instead of his using his nice, comfortable garden. During the pandemic, particularly when they introduced very strange rules that we could only drink outside of pubs and we could only drink with table service and all those crazy things, it doesn't feel real, does it, that we went through all of that? Many pubs and other establishments put an awful lot of effort and a lot of money into their outside areas. Because that was the only place they could technically do business, they spent an awful lot of money converting car parks and otherwise disused outside spaces into nice places for people to come and enjoy a drink and a meal. These places, since the COVID pandemic has subsided somewhat, often still frequented, but are mainly used now for smokers to go into to have their cigarette before returning inside the premises, and this will become more and more the case as the weather continues to deteriorate towards winter. This new smoking ban would mean that these areas go largely unused and almost exclusively completely unused during the colder winter months, meaning that the money that these establishments and these premises and these publicans have poured into these outside areas will have been completely wasted. Instead, this won't stop people from smoking, it just means that people will have to pass through these specifically designed outside areas to go into the street, to go onto the road, to go into residential areas or whatever in order to have a smoke, in order to use any tobacco products. But the PM stressed the health impact of his message. Tobacco use is the UK's single biggest preventable cause of death, killing 2/3 of long-term users and causing 80,000 deaths every year. Look, none of this and none of my opinion is to say that smoking is a good thing. All right, it's become increasingly known, and it is a killer. It's something that causes preventable disease. However, we do, in theory at least, still live in a free country, and if people are willing to put their own health at risk, and if people are willing to pay the tax to help support them with those potential health issues, then we should still be given the freedom of choice to partake in whatever habit it is we choose to partake in. Health authorities also say there is no safe level to exposure from second-hand smoke. Any new ban would only apply to England. It is not yet clear if it would apply to the rest of the UK, although devolved governments, and that would be sort of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, could choose to bring in similar rules. And actually, in our experience, what we've seen is that quite often when these relatively punitive rules come in, for example, the drink driving rules and whatever, the devolved administrations quite often actually take a slightly more authoritarian, a slightly harsher stance on them, with Scotland reducing their drink drive limit to basically zero. When questioned on the proposals, Sir Keir and the government said he was going to take decisions in this space and more details would be revealed. Again, good to see he is really focusing on the important issues and the ones that the great British public actually care about. Not addressing the boats, not addressing the cost of living, not addressing the wars abroad, not addressing the stabbings and all the other crime at Notting Hill. No, smoking. That's the big issue. It's important to get the balance right, he said, adding that the NHS is on its knees. Now, dare I suggest, and dare I be controversial here and say that the fact the NHS is on its knees is not because of a few people smoking. The fact the NHS is on its knees is because of many years of mismanagement, many years of misuse, a horribly bloated and inefficient service where there are far too many managers, far too many quangos being paid far too much to achieve very little, and there are far too many people using limited services who maybe shouldn't be eligible to use them. The King's speech at the state opening of Parliament last month promised to reintroduce legislation proposed by the previous government which would have outlawed the sale of tobacco to anyone born on or after January 2009. Now, if we are to phase out smoking entirely in this country, then actually using that method is fairly effective. It means that people who have smoked for many years and are potentially addicted to it aren't suddenly deprived of nicotine and tobacco products. Simply doing that would drive the demand underground and would make money and put money into the pockets of criminals. Health professionals have welcomed the proposals. As I say, it depends who they ask. It depends who they've got on board to say what they want them to say. Dr. Layla McKay of the NHS Confederation told BBC's Radio 4 Today programme the plans would reduce the huge problems that are caused to the individual and to society from smoking. Now, of course, like I say, smoking has very serious health implications for a lot of people. However, I don't really see how it has massive societal impact. As a non-smoker, I very rarely feel that other people smoking interferes with my life. However, that is a personal opinion. Other people may feel very differently. Deborah Arnott, Chief Executive of the charity Action on Smoking and Health, said the public expected not to have to breathe in tobacco smoke in places like children's play areas and seating areas outside pubs, restaurants and cafes. Now, of course, there is room here for some common sense, isn't there? If you go to what they call a family-friendly pub, a Hungry Horse or something like that, and there's a children's outdoor play area, then yes, of course it makes sense that people aren't stood around the outside of the play area puffing away on a cigarette. However, if you go to a wet-led drinkers pub on a weekend where people are watching the football and having a few drinks, then them standing outside in a covered smoking area isn't going to really cause an awful lot of harm to innocent people who don't want to be there. But she added it was important to ensure that there are still outdoor areas for people to smoke in the open air rather than inside their own homes. However, those in the hospitality sector are worried the ban will hurt businesses, and this is a hospitality sector which, for want of a better expression, is already on its arse due to repeated legislation, increased taxation on alcohol, and the years of COVID and of stringent lockdowns which put many people out of business entirely. This needs to be thought through very carefully before we damage businesses and economic growth and jobs, Kate Nichols, Chief Executive of the trade group UK Hospitality, said. JD Wetherspoon founder Tim Martin, Wetherspoons, if you're not from the UK, being the biggest chain of pubs here in the UK, said, "I don't think it'll have a big effect on our business one way or the other." That could be true. There could be some logic in that. Of course, if people are going to smoke, they'll just take a few further steps outside the pub garden, and go and smoke on the street. But I don't really see how that's actually achieved anything. I don't see how that's benefiting anyone. If you are a smoker and you want to continue to smoke and you're not put off by the fact you may have to go out into the pub garden or some dodgy smoking area in the rain, you're not going to be put off by having to take a few more steps to go out onto the street or into the road or whatever to have a cigarette. Chief Executive of Revolution Bars, Rob Pitcher, said he was not convinced smoking in beer gardens was prevalent enough to be putting a strain on the NHS. That really is the argument, isn't it? Like I say, if you stop people from smoking in one particular area or you push them somewhere else, is that really going to have an impact on the overall burden that the NHS faces because of people smoking in general? According to official government data in England and Wales, the number of pub closures over the first 3 months of 2024 was up 51% compared to the same period of the previous year. And the same period of the previous year would have certainly experienced more of the COVID fallout than now. Realistically, any business that was going to fail based purely on the punitive lockdowns that we experienced in the UK probably would have done so before last year. So that is incredibly alarming for anyone in the hospitality industry. The political opposition, including Conservative leadership contenders, have criticised the proposals as over-regulation. And yes, overreach and over-regulation does seem to be a little bit of a byword, doesn't it, that could be attributed to Keir Starmer. Priti Patel, the former Home Secretary, said the plans amounted to nanny state regulations and would be economically damaging. It's actually very refreshing to hear Priti Patel come out with something that isn't complete drivel. Former Home Office Minister Robert Jenrick said the last thing this country needs is thousands more pubs closing. Yes, another nail in the coffin for the culture and the Britishness of this very country. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage described the proposals as government overreach on a scale that is utterly ridiculous. Now, Nigel Farage, being a big fan of pubs, I don't believe he's a smoker actually, but he will see, like many people, including myself who use pubs, will see the impact that this is likely to have on those businesses and on the people who use those businesses. We saw during COVID a significant number of people changing from being pub users, because they no longer had the option, to drinking at home. They found it more convenient, they found it cheaper, and that's disregarding obviously the reasons people go to pubs in the first place, but many people never went back. And if going to the pub and having a drink and then having a cigarette becomes even more awkward and becomes more of a chore, more laborious, and invariably more expensive, then people may continue to drift off from using the pub and start drinking at home instead. Frankly, if they do this, it'll be the death knell of the pub, he told the BBC. Now, the pubs have faced many death knells and many haven't survived, but there are still a few hanging on, and what they don't need is further regulation and further restrictions on their customers. Around 12.9% of people aged 18 and over in the UK, about 6.4 million people, smoked cigarettes in 2022, according to the most recently available data from the Office of National Statistics. That is the lowest proportion of current smokers since records began in 2011. Those aged 25 to 34 age represent the highest proportion of smokers, while the lowest are those aged 65 and over. In England alone, smoking caused an estimated 74,600 deaths in 2019, according to NHS England's latest available data. There are 408,700 hospital admissions due to smoking in 2022-2023. In its guidance about passive or second-hand smoke, Cancer Research UK said all forms of exposure to smoking are unsafe, whilst the NHS says second-hand smoke is a lethal cocktail of more than 4,000 irritants, toxins and cancer-causing substances. So what do you think? Do you think this is government overreach? Do you think this will be the final death knell for the last remaining pubs? Or do you think this is genuinely in the best interests of people's health? Let me know in the comment section below. And for all of you, stay safe and stay sane.